I'm Indy and this is another Great War live stream weapons special, today featuring Russian weapons from the First World War. And my expert guest today, who is always my expert for these things, is Othais from C&Rsenal. If you're not familiar with that channel, it's a fantastic channel that, of course, covers weapons. And there's also a series about small arms from the First World War, which goes into the most minute detail you literally could ever hope to want to know about weapons from the First World War. So, Othais, first of all, Happy New Year, and it's great to have you here today.
Happy New Year, Indy. We're off to 2018 now, and I assume that you guys are heading towards a dramatic end to your series at some point.
Well, at some point, you know, I like to think that I don't know what's going to happen in the future episodes, so, you know, it looks like Germany's poised to win at this point, you know, with the Americans not there and Russia pulling out of the war. I really think the Germans can crack this one now.
All right, so like Indy covered, I'm from C&Rsenal. We do a very in-depth series on World War I firearms. Most people find it too boring, so that's why we come over here to show you snippets of what was going on in the war with the Great War team. So today, we've managed to gather enough resources to have Russia. Now, the reason these are few and far between is a lot of this stuff can be rare, and getting two very rare pieces in the same room at the same time requires a lot of begging and borrowing. So we managed to do that today. We've got everything appropriate, so whenever Indy and the team are ready, we can get into this thing.
We are ready. I'm just going to say a couple of background words because I know there's plenty of information out there about Russia in the First World War. We've certainly covered it enough. But there's some misinformation as well that has to do with certainly with the economy and production of the First World War. And while Russia certainly had a lot of economic woes and production woes from particularly 1916 going into the revolution, at the beginning of the war, it was the world's fourth largest economy. And even though it was still relatively backwards in many areas and had no coherent economic strategy because every minister reported individually to the Tsar instead of talking to each other about the whole economic plan, it was growing so much to the point of, production-wise, that the German high command would rather have war now in 1914 with Russia because they thought it was unwinnable in 1917, which is, of course, one of the underlying many causes of the war. So you can look more of that up for yourself later on, but we'll obviously have to talk a little bit about production. But why don't we just dive in, and you can start us off with something really fascinating and groovy and weapony like you always do, right?
Sure. Now, as we usually do, I'll go ahead and start with the smaller handguns. And just as Indy was saying, Russia did have a foot into the modern era in terms of production capacity, but design-wise, they were a little behind the curve. And not for terrible reasons, they just hadn't done their update homework just yet. Now, again, despite the ability to produce a good bit of equipment, they are not by any means short compared to, say, Italy or others in terms of their ability to produce. The problem is that they also were capable of fielding a lot of manpower very, very quickly. And in doing so, they sort of washed out their own production. Now, it's not that they didn't, it's not that they couldn't produce a lot, it's just that they couldn't produce enough to keep up with the sheer numbers of men that they could put into the field. So in a lot of ways, they would have to reach for older technology. Now in this case, I happen to have one of their first metallic cartridge guns, and one that would remain all the way through the war. So if we take a closer look, we're going to see, the Smith & Wesson No. 3 Russian. This particular one is the third model and probably one of the more common ones available by the time of the Great War. Now, interesting thing about this gun is that it was adopted by the Russians right when they were considering going to a single-shot Remington rolling block style pistol, and their whole emphasis for buying this back in the 1870s is that they wanted to be able to load a gun quickly on horseback. So the good thing here compared to a lot of solid frames of the day is that you could break it open, simultaneously eject all your cartridges, and then stick some fresh ones down in there. Now, this is a single action only revolver, which means that you have to manually cock the hammer for every shot. By the time of the Great War, most people are at the very least dealing with a double action. As a matter of fact, the only other single action I know of merit is that Reichs revolver that we talked about with Germany. So every time cock, every time pull. This means very slow if you're trying to use it in extremely close quarters, although it does make it a very crisp, accurate gun with this long barrel, long sight radius. Very good for long range work for a handgun, but realistically that's not what handguns are for by the time of the Great War. They're for trench clearing and personal defense. Now, a lot of people might comment about this trigger spur. It's a very interesting shape, very almost fantastical. Like, it doesn't seem like you see a lot of military handguns with a projection like this that would be so prone to damage. But the good thing is that this gun was built around ergonomics. So we have our knuckle back here that fits our webbing of our hand, and then we can place our middle finger, and I know it's hard to see, but we place our middle finger over that, and that gives us very good control of this single action gun. This is before two-handed shooting was really popular. So if you wanted to control a gun with one hand, this is the way to go. It gives you the most leverage. All right, so if we back out, we can see it is a very big handgun, very heavy, and it should be very muzzle down. But again, we've put our middle finger way out in the middle point of the gun, and it gives us a little bit more steering control. This is actually probably the best of the single action pistols you could hope for if you were going to have a single action only gun. Unfortunately, it's single action only, so it's not terrifically useful by the time of the war, like I said. And so they're not going to produce any more of them. They're not going to, reignite production. But they're going to field as many as they can because it eats up rear line and maybe artillery troops or anybody else that's not expected to really be in a forward combat role. This gives them something that they can hang on their belt.
Now, what were the production years of this then? I mean, when did they, you said the 1870s, but do you know when specifically they began production and when they left off officially?
This gun would emerge around 1871. We actually have a whole special on it if you want to get into the details, but realistically, they were done with production when they came out with the next revolver that I'm going to talk about today. Now, I've seen sources that say that these were produced or at least assembled from parts on until like 1900 or a little after. I've also seen sources that say that they stopped 2-3 years before they started the next gun. So vaguely, this gun is done with production easily before 1900. And anything that might have been assembled after 1900 was probably for police use or repair depot work or something like that. I've just seen a few disagreements. Regardless, this gun is done way before the First World War. It's just that it's still sitting in inventory and it's still available for use, so why not?
Now, when still sitting in inventory, are we talking in the tens of thousands, the hundreds of thousands, the millions? I mean, is this still, I mean, as you said, of course, issuing it to artillery and to the rear lines and stuff, that's great. But what kind of numbers would we expect to see this in?
That one's been hard for me to pin down because this gun will also show up in service with Montenegro and Bulgaria during the war, because the Russians would surplus a lot of these out during the Balkan Wars to their allies. And so, reasonably, somewhere around, oh good lord, I had the production numbers in my books for the previous episode and now I'm confusing them with other production numbers, but you've got hundreds of thousands of these available. But Russia has gifted away at a minimum 60,000 and probably more. So the question of how many Russia still had in their inventory, hard to say. But that does mean that it will turn up in other places throughout the Great War. All right, now these are the leftovers. So let's look at Russia's top of the line, #1 primary handgun for the war. This is what they consider to be their best. It's the Nagant 1895, and I know a lot of you that are familiar with this gun are currently scoffing, and maybe not for the wrong reasons, but let's take a closer look. So if we zoom in, this is a gun that comes out in 1895. Now, it's actually based off of a very strong historic line, the Nagant family of revolvers. This one happens to be Belgian, and this one is much, much earlier. This is an 1870s model, and then into the 1880s, they simplified this design, and then beyond that, they started marketing, to places like Norway and things like that. A lot of European countries adopted a gun that was descended from this particular model. This is a very smooth, single, and double action revolver. It's a gate loader, which was common at the time, so it's not, archaic by any means for when it came out. The problem is, by 1895, we're gonna see more advanced designs in the market. We remember from some of our earlier episodes with the Great War and from our primer series that swing out cylinders are catching on in the 1890s, and even beyond that, we have Abadi systems for rapid loading of gate loaders. There's a lot of ideas to improve the revolver at that point in history, because that is sort of the tail end of the revolver's lifespan. And it's the beginning of semi-automatic handguns. So what that means is a lot of countries are looking in 1895 through 1900 at the very earliest semi-automatic handguns, and they are not running well. The number one reason for this is because of ammunition. Ammunition technology also had to sort of catch up. When you're dealing with a semi-automatic handgun, you are absolutely dependent on the cartridge to run reliably and consistently within a certain standard deviation, or else your gun won't run. With a revolver, whether the cartridge goes bang or not, the cylinder still rotates, the mechanism still works. Now today, not as much people really know that semi-automatic handguns are the more reliable system because the ammo is dialed in, but on into the 50s and 60s, you would see people in America especially commenting that the revolver is more reliable than the semi-automatic handgun. And a lot of that was the holdover attitude because you were dealing with a gun that was at the absolute end of its development cycle. It had been around for over a century and it was getting improved constantly. And so you finally have swing out cylinders and fast loading and easy use and improved bore axis and all these handling characteristics going into the best possible revolver, and you've just started making semi-automatic handguns, so they need decades to catch up. Well, that's why by 1895, Russia should have been able to pick a very advanced handgun. And they did not. They actually chose something that was a very safe choice, along with one sort of gimmick. So again, let's take a closer look. This gun is single and double action, although that in World War I would have been an officer's model. Many of the very basic models were produced in single action only because Russians felt that they couldn't trust their troops to actually use a double action without shooting themselves in the foot somehow. That's despite the fact that this has one of the heaviest trigger pulls of any handgun in World War I. Now, the big reason for that heavy trigger pull, for most of you who have shot these in the commercial market, is that they were actually refurbished after World War II, and the tolerances were sort of eaten up, and they become extremely heavy, and they tend to snag right here before dropping. Very uncomfortable gun. This particular one has not been refurbished. You can tell by the fact that it's still got its original bluing that fades fairly easily worn off. They did not have the best bluing process. These guns are not the deep painted black with the very fresh looking wood grips of the refurbs after World War II. This gun right here is extremely smooth. It's just heavy. So when I pull this through, don't get me wrong, it's one of the heaviest triggers that we've shot in our show, but you can tell I'm not struggling with it, and it's going very smoothly. So they weren't as bad as people make them out to be, just not great. Now, the reason why it's so heavy again is because, watch the cylinder very carefully. It's going to index forward. See it go forward there? Now, the Russians had become obsessed with a problem with revolvers, which is that when you fire a revolver, inherently you lose some pressure, muzzle velocity, power. It's all coming out right here because you have escaping gas in that gap between the cylinder and the barrel. So they wanted to index the cylinder forward to seal against the barrel. And as part of that, it uses a very interesting cartridge. This is modern production. The original would have been a bit more tapered instead of funneled, but it has a seal and the bullet is down in there. This is not an empty case, this is a loaded case. So what happens is this gets forced up against the cone and that way it seals in the gas. Beautiful little system to get the most velocity out of your revolver, but honestly completely unnecessary because this is still a very mild cartridge and that's a lot of sort of hump to get over for your trigger for very little payoff for extra velocity with such a small, light cartridge. It's a very odd decision that they made. Otherwise, this is just a gate loader. It's a 7-shot, so you at least get an extra shot for how small you went on your diameter and how low your power is. Again, you could get a higher powered cartridge and a bigger bullet if you were to go ahead and do 6 shots and give wider walls between so that you didn't risk damaging the cylinder. They opted for more rounds, smaller cartridge, lighter damage. Again, that would also benefit in the lack of recoil. But if you're looking to sort of control the recoil and handling of a gun like this, I don't know why you want a 20-pound trigger. It's a very odd decision by the Russians, and one that we're going to do some more research on and get into more development on in our own show.
Now, why then does this have such a bad rep? I mean, what were the real drawbacks that would make people for the last 120 years say, can't believe they picked this one as their standard?
It absolutely is a very mild cartridge. It absolutely does have a very heavy trigger. The refurbs in the American market have really driven the bad reputation because they have a heavy trigger that has also been so shellacked over with new finish that when you try to pull back a refurb, right about here where it should release the hammer very smoothly, there's just this huge wall of pressure and you have to really muscle up to 30 pounds to get it to drop. This one is a smooth but very heavy pull all the way through. it's still not a great design. The reason why a heavy trigger on a double action is such a problem for people is that when you extend your arm, especially one-handed shooting like these were for World War I, if I start really flexing on that, my muscles in here and my arm are going to tighten up. And so it's going to make it want to wander off target, and it depends on, by the way, even that, if you have weak hands, you start shaking just trying to get the pressure through. So any extra pressure on double action means that you're likely to throw your shot off. Now, this didn't bother them so much at the time because the feeling was that single action, where you cock manually, point, and then pull the trigger, which is very light and crisp, and actually works very well in this gun if it hasn't been refurbed. Single action is for actually aiming. Double action is when somebody's 3 feet away and you're panicking. So in their minds, if you're off by 6 inches, nobody cares for double action. Of course, we've moved away from that in the modern era.
Okay, and you said again that this entered service with them in 1895, was that right?
Yeah, the model number is 1895. Now, of course, I have not gone fully into my research on this gun. I like to be very careful about what I say, but it would have emerged 1895, 1896. Sometimes the model names precede the actual production. This gun was the standard all the way up until the Tokarev in the 1930s, and then even beyond that, they kept producing through World War II. This was a very long-lived gun, despite being the fact that it was a bit archaic the day it was adopted. Now, in defense of Russia, being adopted in 1895, this is right on the cusp of the quote-unquote modern swing-out revolver. So if they had waited 5 years, they might have had a better perspective on what was going on. We see this with Austria-Hungary, where we talked about the Gasser double and single action revolver, which a very odd adoption in 1898, because by then, just those 3 short years, they should have very clearly seen that something like this, which the Gasser is very much like this, something like this really isn't going to work. The unusual feature of this gun, though, is we've talked about the Abadie system before, where you open the gate and then you can pull the trigger to get it to cycle the cylinder and not move the hammer, therefore not risking shooting anybody. This does not have that. You have to manually index that cylinder every time you want to use the attached ejecting rod. So you have to line it up manually, eyeball it, then pop your cartridge out with a little pook, and then line it up manually, pop it out. There's no automatic indexing, which was very common even by 1880s technology. So a bit of an odd choice.
Now, Othais, you said before we were filming, when we were setting up, that you actually had a special, well, treat for us in terms of handguns. And since we've seen the 2 Russians now, I'm very curious what actually that would be.
All right, I'm gonna have to delay the special treat for 1 second because I know you're gonna get a lot of comments on this. Russia also used things like the FN 1903 in very small numbers, a fair number of FN 1900s, and the Mauser C96, particularly fond of the Bolo model. Those are all covered in individual episodes over at our site, but we've also already sort of talked about a lot of those guns in previous specials here, so don't just sort of say, well, you didn't say this, that, or the other. We've covered those guns where they were more appropriately tied to their original countries.
Well, I think a lot of our fans, people watching, have probably seen most of our weapon specials. I would imagine it's a lot of the same people. So let's hope that people actually remember and have learned something, you know?
Yep, that was just my CYA. So we will just set this down, and I'll show you something kind of special, because while we were talking about that number 3, we happened to be loaned this, again, by our friend Michael Carrick. Thank you so much for the rare and wonderful things that he manages to turn up to loan us. This right here is a number 3 new model, which isn't the most exceptional firearm you will ever see, except for the fact that it still has this trigger spur, which most new models do not. And the other odd thing about this gun is that it's adapted to a rimfire cartridge instead of a centerfire cartridge, which tells us that this gun is an Ottoman handgun. Now, we are not going to be doing an Ottoman handgun special. We will talk about rifles, but realistically, the Ottomans did a lot like some of these other countries like Bulgaria, where they just adopted out from other manufacturers. So there were Ottoman contract C96s. They're just like other C96s. And there were Ottoman contract FN 1903s. They're just like FN 1903s, and so things like that. Well, this particular gun is uniquely Ottoman, and it was probably still around for the war. It's very hard to track internal Ottoman documents. Not a lot of things remain, but I'm gonna tell you what the numbers produced. This is still on hand, and rimfire was still being used by the Ottomans all the way through World War I. So let's take a look at this unique little mix of technologies. So zooming in, we have a single action only, again, so we must work the hammer every time. Top brake with a modified, sort of prettier looking top brake. And then simultaneous eject, load everything at once. The big killer here, and I'm sure it's gonna be difficult for you guys to see on the live show, but it'll show up on the edited show a little bit better, is right in here. We just have a split through the top of that breech, and our hammer rests right on top of that split. It is a rim fire cartridge. Now the reason for this is the Ottomans had adopted 44-40 Henry, and they adopted the rifles with them all the way back in the day, and they just kept staying with that same cartridge because everything was already in it, and they never wanted to make the jump to switching over their ammo system. So they had a lot of unusual guns still chambered in rimfire. As a matter of fact, when we get around to it at some point, I have a Gosser that is also in this same rimfire cartridge. So they were really taking anything they could get and modifying it or ordering it pre-modified for this particular rimfire cartridge, which is just really interesting by the time you get to 1914, because that is very dated technology. Single action only with a rimfire cartridge. There's going to be a lot of potential issues there, and yet they still managed to defend themselves pretty well from the British. So that'll tell you that while the handgun is useful and can be very good in trench warfare, it's not the primary weapon for most nations, and it's really more of an afterthought.
Now, would this be something that you'd see with more the standard for the men, or would this be something you'd see more among officers? This would be a regular issue? And what kind of numbers are we talking?
To my understanding, and again, Ottoman history of sort of ordnance is very opaque, very, very opaque. If you want to get through the history of it, you have to go through Turkish sources, and a lot of Turkish museums are guided. So you really don't get clear data, and I really don't have a clear partner in a lot of this development. But reasonably, with the numbers ordered, this is not just restricted to purely officer use when it came out. And by the time later on to World War I imagine most officers had private purchases that were more significant than this. So again, this is probably something that you'd see issued to NCOs or artillery. That is a best guess based on the way this would sort of stack and the numbers produced. That is also sort of going off what limited photo evidence I have. I tend to look at holsters and scale and sort of the last little bit of the gun that I can see and get a little impression. That's about as good as I've got right now for Ottoman. It's been a very hard nut to crack.
Well, Othais, thank you very much for showing us the handguns. It's always a pleasure having you here. Now, can you maybe send people over to one of your videos about one of the weapons we've talked about today so they can see a more in-depth look?
Absolutely, Indy. Now, as the time we're recording this, and I know that's going to be a delay before it's released, but at the time we're recording this, I only have one really good Russian video up, and that's on the Smith & Wesson No. 3 revolver. The reason for that is I've been waiting on some very strong material to actually be freshly written, and now I have to translate it from Cyrillic. So I am working my way through the best histories I can for the Nagant and for the rifles that we're going to talk about in a little while, but go ahead and check out our Smith & Wesson for now, and by the time this releases, maybe there'll be some more material for you to look at. And otherwise, don't forget that you can tune back into the Great War because they have specials on Russia and the Ottoman Empire as well.
And we'll put all kinds of links below for everybody to see all of this great stuff. Okay, well, thank you very much. And everybody out there, do not forget to click subscribe so you never miss any of these more fantastic weapon specials in addition to our regular episodes. See you next time.